Most women would have smiled, politely said thank you, and tucked the insult into the back of their mind. But she was not most women. She unwrapped the box slowly, her fingers precise, her eyes fixed on the man across from her. He was watching with the smug expectation of someone who believed the performance of generosity was enough to hide the truth. Inside was a necklace, if you could call it that. Thin chain, cheap metal, the kind that would turn skin green after a few hours. The pendant was a dull, cloudy stone set slightly crooked in its frame. She could almost smell the bargain bin it had come from. And yet his grin widened as if this was not just a gift but a test he was sure she would fail. What would you do if someone handed you something that was less about the object itself and more about what it said they thought you were worth? Would you laugh it off? Would you confront them? Or would you bide your time letting the lesson write itself in silence? She didn't flinch. She let her lips curve in the smallest of smiles, the kind that could mean anything. "It's thoughtful," she said softly, her voice warm enough to pass for gratitude, but laced with something quieter, something he didn't hear yet. Around them, the restaurant hummed with low conversations, clinking glasses, the scent of roasted lamb and garlic butter. The candle between them flickered, throwing light across his face in restless patterns. He leaned back in his chair, satisfied, swirling his wine like a man who believed he had just done something grand. He talked about his week-long hours, difficult meetings, how he'd managed to find the time to pick this up for her. She let him talk, noting every self-congratulatory detail, every subtle dig about how she didn't really need expensive things because she was so simple. She nodded, sipped her drink, let him think she was listening to the words instead of the subtext. You see, people like him counted on you reacting in the moment. They expected either the gushing gratitude or the wounded protest. What they didn't expect, what they didn't know how to handle, was patience. When they left the restaurant, the winter air was sharp enough to sting her cheeks. He draped an arm around her shoulder the way you might claim something you believe is already yours. The cheap chain felt cold in her hand, where she'd tucked it back into the box. She wondered if he noticed she hadn't put it on. Days passed. She didn't mention the gift again. She wore the jewelry she'd always worn, understated, but of quality pieces that carried stories, not price tags. He never asked about the necklace, perhaps assuming she was saving it for a special occasion. But inside her, something was shifting. Not rage, not even hurt, just a deep, anchored certainty that this was not about the metal or the stone. This was about value. About how he saw her, how little he believed he needed to offer for her to stay. One night she found herself in her study, the soft lamplight pooling over her desk. She opened the box again, turning the necklace in her fingers. It was almost weightless, like an object pretending to have meaning. She set it down and picked up her pen. She began making a list. Not of things she wanted. She'd long since learned the difference between wants and worth, but of moments. Instances where he had measured out his care in teaspoons, where he had chosen the smallest effort that would pass as enough. They stretched back further than she'd let herself remember. Missed birthdays replaced with half-hearted dinners. Promises of help that never materialized. Words of affection that came only when they served him. By the time she set the pen down, the list was longer than she expected. She folded it neatly and placed it inside the box beneath the necklace. A record not for him but for herself. You might think she was preparing to leave, but endings when they're clean don't always come with slamming doors. Sometimes they arrive in stages, each one disguised as something else. She was not ready to walk away. Not yet, but she was ready to teach. And here's the thing about the most expensive lessons: they are not loud. They are not explosive. They are deliberate, crafted to be remembered. The next time she saw him, she brought a gift, wrapped in deep green paper tied with silk ribbon. Heavy in the hand, deliberate in its weight. He smiled, surprised, unwrapping it with the same easy arrogance she'd worn 2 weeks ago. Inside was a leather-bound book, elegant, costly, the kind of thing you don't buy without intention. On the first page, in her precise handwriting, she had written just one sentence. People always reveal what they think you're worth, and sometimes they need to be reminded what you're worth to yourself. He looked up, searching her face for the meaning. She smiled just enough to keep him guessing. The lesson had begun. He didn't say much that night, not right away. The weight of the book sat between them on the table, his fingers resting on the leather cover like it might give him answers if he held it long enough. She could see the flicker in his eyes, that tiny hesitation, when a man who thinks he's clever realizes the game might not be his anymore. They ate in a low-lit corner of a bistro. She had chosen the kind of place that whispered elegance rather than shouted it. She noticed how he kept glancing at the book as though it might open itself, but she said nothing, just kept her voice calm, her laughter soft, her attention occasionally drifting elsewhere. That unsettled him more than confrontation ever could. You've felt it before, haven't you? That subtle shift when you stop handing someone the reassurance they've grown used to. They lean in closer, they search your eyes more, they measure their words not because they suddenly respect you, but because they sense they're losing the easy hold they once had. Halfway through the meal, he tried to break the silence about it. So, the book, it's beautiful. But what's with the note? She tilted her head as if she needed to recall. It's just a truth I've learned, she said lightly, sipping her wine. We don't always notice when people show us their measure of us, but once we do, well, things change. His smile was tight, the kind that masks irritation. He tried to pivot the conversation toward business, his latest deal, his cleverness in outmaneuvering competitors. She let him talk, nodding when polite, but never giving him the full warmth he was fishing for. Over the next few weeks, her shift became impossible for him to ignore. She stopped accommodating last-minute changes to their plans. She no longer laughed at stories she'd heard a dozen times before. She wore dresses he'd once said were too much, and jewelry he hadn't given her, walking into rooms like she was her own spotlight. The cheap necklace stayed in its box. Sometimes she'd glance at it in the morning, almost amused. It was no longer just an object, it was a marker, a reminder of the exact moment she decided to step off the pedestal he thought he'd built for her. One Saturday afternoon, he invited her to a family gathering at his parents' home. She went, but differently this time. She arrived on time, not early, not waiting in the car for him, and carried herself like the guest of honor, though she barely said a word about herself. His mother complimented her dress. His sister asked where she'd found her earrings. His uncle lingered longer than necessary in conversation. She could feel his discomfort growing. He was used to being the center, the one drawing attention. Now the attention shifted naturally toward her without her even trying. It's a peculiar kind of power, isn't it? The power of being seen without begging to be. Later, when they were alone in the car, he finally asked, "What's going on with you lately?" She smiled, just a hint. "I started treating myself the way I should have been treated all along." He scoffed, a brittle sound. "Are you implying I haven't—" "I'm not implying anything," she cut in softly, her tone like silk hiding steel. "I'm saying I've remembered my own worth. And once you remember that, you can't unremember it." He didn't have an answer for that. The truth is, she wasn't angry anymore. The initial sting of the cheap gift had burned away, leaving clarity in its place. She understood now that it had never been about money. It had been about the calculation, the belief that she would accept whatever crumbs were given because her gratitude was assumed. And here's the cruelest irony for men like him. Once you stop craving their approval, they start craving yours. The calls came more often. The invitations grew more elaborate. He began buying her surprise gifts, each one more expensive than the last, as though the price tag could erase the first insult. She accepted them with the same mild smile, never mistaking them for proof of love. You see, the real lesson wasn't about getting better gifts. It was about shifting the balance so far that he no longer controlled the measure of her value. She did. But she wasn't finished. The most expensive lesson was still to come. He began to court her as if money could reset time. Dinners at places that booked out months in advance, flowers large enough to hide behind a bracelet that caught light like a promise. He arrived with a bouquet one evening, all soft peach and dusty rose, as if color could apologize for calculation. She took the flowers and placed them in a cracked teacup she had kept for years, a quiet monument to things that looked whole until you looked closer. He did not notice the crack. That told her more than any apology ever would. You know that stage, right? The grand gestures after the small betrayal, the way people think a louder performance can drown out the original insult. But you are not fooled, not anymore. Once you see the measure, you cannot unsee it. Every bouquet becomes a calculator. One afternoon, she slipped into a jeweler on a side street, the kind with velvet trays and people who speak in music rather than sales pitches. She placed the cheap necklace on the counter, the metal winking under the soft lights like it wanted to pretend. The jeweler held it with 2 fingers and a careful smile. "Plated," he said gently. The stone was glass, the setting crooked enough to catch on fabric. She thanked him and returned it to its box, as weightless as the words that had come with it. On her way home, she stopped by a stationery shop and bought heavy paper, the kind that absorbs ink with dignity. That night she wrote. Not a letter to him, a ledger to herself, not of money, but of moments. The time he called her simple when she chose restraint over spectacle. The time he spoke about her to friends as if she were an accessory he had acquired pretty and portable. The time he suggested that women like her did not need anything too fine because they were not the type to be noticed. The lines built like quiet bricks. She folded the pages and tied them with ribbon, placed them in the same box as the necklace, and slid the box into a drawer. When he called the next day, his voice was bright. A charity gala, he said, black tie. He wanted her on his arm. There would be photograph speeches, the kind of evening where people evaluated value through shine and proximity. She said yes. Then she made a call of her own to the event coordinator she knew from a separate circle that he had never asked about. A small request, she said, with a smile in her voice. A last-minute item on the silent auction list if possible. A framed piece she would deliver herself. The coordinator laughed softly. For you always. Here is the truth no one warns you about. The quiet ones are the most dangerous once they decide to move. The shadow wife, the quiet mother, the woman who lets the room believe she is a soft chair rather than a locked door. The plan is simple because it is honest. She never lies. She simply turns on the light and lets people see what was always there. The gala arrived draped in gold. Candles floated in glass 100 small suns. She wore a dress that skimmed her like a secret, and the bracelet he had given her because she liked the way it felt against her pulse. He liked the way people watched them as they entered. He breathed in admiration like oxygen. She let him. Not all truths need to be revealed in the doorway. They mingled. He introduced her to men who looked past her at first, then looked again, recalibrating. She spoke with steady curiosity, never oversharing, never bending into the shape of anyone's expectation. The room altered around her by inches, a slow tide you only notice when your shoes get wet. In a quiet corner, the silent auction displays gleamed under soft light. Paintings a week at a coastal house, a vintage piano. And there, among the frames, the piece she had submitted, a shadow box holding 2 items. On the left, the cheap necklace pinned delicately. On the right, a single page from her ledger, typeset in clean lines, so the words could not be dismissed as angry script. At the bottom, a title in small print, measure. You felt that catch in your throat, did you not? Not from cruelty, but from clarity. She had not named him. She had not shamed him. She had placed a mirror without pointing at it. He did not see it at first. He was busy telling a story about a deal he had closed, about being the man who always got there first. She listened the way a tide listens to a shoreline. When his glass was empty, she touched his sleeve. Let's walk, she said softly. They reached the display together. She watched his eyes land on the necklace, then slide to the page beside it. For a heartbeat, his expression did not change. Then his jaw tightened small, almost invisible. He set his glass down. Who submitted this, he asked. His voice was light, a thread that might break if pulled. I did, she said. There was a pause, the kind where whole futures pivot. This is, he began, then stopped. He was calculating outcomes. Anger would look small. Dismissal would look smaller. He smiled instead, brittle at the edges. Clever, he said. Very clever. She looked at the shadow box again, at the cheap metal held under good light. The bid sheet was already filling not with money but with attention. People were reading the words, the ones that did not name anyone, yet named everything that mattered. She felt no glee, no triumph, only ease. You see it now, do you not? The lesson was not the cost of the frame or the gala or the dress. The lesson was the price of underestimation. The invoice was addressed to his pride. He did not explode. That would have been too easy. He excused himself and went to speak with the host. She moved through the room like a soft wind, nothing to hold, everything to feel. When she finally stepped onto the balcony, the city spread breathed below. She placed her hands on the rail and let the air cool her skin. The cheap gift had not vanished. It had transformed as all true lessons do. Behind her, the door slid open. Footsteps. His presence held tight. He said her name as if it were a question and an accusation. She turned calm as a tide. Now, she thought, now we will see what he does when the measure is public. He stood in the doorway, the warm gold from the ballroom spilling behind him, turning his outline into something almost regal if you didn't know what it was made of. His eyes flickered, not quite meeting hers, the kind of glance a man gives when he's fighting the instinct to lash out. You made your point, he said, his voice low, controlled. That control was the only thing keeping his pride from shattering across the marble floor. She tilted her head slightly. Did I? A beat passed. The muffled hum of the gala wrapped around them, glasses clinking, laughter bubbling, but here on the balcony, the air felt thinner. "You're embarrassing yourself," he added, and there it was, the script. The one people like him reach for when they can't discredit the truth, so they try to shame the person holding it. She didn't flinch. "I'm standing in my truth," she said softly, "and you don't get to tell me how that looks." Have you noticed how the people who teach you the smallest lessons often resist learning the biggest ones? They think the ground beneath them is solid until the day they realize it's been softening under their feet for years. He stepped forward close enough for her to catch the faint scent of his cologne. "You could have just told me," he said, the edge of something desperate curling his words. "You didn't have to put it out there." She held his gaze. "I did tell you, just not in words you wanted to hear." And that was the pivot. You could see it in his posture, the stiffening, the calculation, the first ripple of something that might have been humility if he'd let it grow. But instead, he exhaled sharply, stepped back, and tried for a smile. "You're making a scene." "No," she said, her voice steady as the night air. "I'm making a statement." He didn't reply. Instead, he turned and walked back inside, his shoulders squared in that performative way men do when they want the world to think they're leaving on their own terms. She stayed on the balcony, leaning into the coolness, watching the city lights blur into soft halos. When she returned to the auction table later, the shadow box had a small crowd around it. People were reading the words, leaning in to see the necklace pinned under glass. Some looked curious. Others nodded as though they'd read something they'd always known but never spoken aloud. By the end of the night, it had the highest bid of any item. The winning bidder, a woman in her 60s with silver hair swept into a chignon, approached her quietly. "It's not the necklace I want," she said, "it's the reminder." That more than anything felt like the closing of a door, not slammed, just firmly, irrevocably shut. You see, the point of her lesson had never been to humiliate him. It had been to reclaim the measure of her own worth in a way no one could ever hand back to her like a trinket in a box. The necklace had become a symbol, but not of the insult. It was a monument to the moment she stopped waiting for validation and began speaking in actions. In the weeks that followed, he tried to smooth things over without ever admitting fault. More dinners, more gifts, more attempts to pull her back into the orbit where he dictated the pace, but his reach no longer landed. She had stepped outside the circle, and once you see the walls from the other side, you can't forget how small they are. One evening, he called her from his car, the sound of rain tapping against his windshield. "I miss how things were," he said. She let the silence sit until it almost hurt. "I don't," she replied. He exhaled as though bracing for a fight, but there was none. Just her voice, calm and final like the closing line of a story. "We're not who we were when you gave me that gift, and I'm not going back." After they hung up, she opened her drawer and took out the box. She lifted the necklace, let it dangle for a moment, then placed it back. The ledger stayed where it was, ribbon-tied, a record not of him, but of the line she'd drawn for herself. You know now, don't you? The most expensive lesson is the one that costs someone their illusion of control. And once paid, there are no refunds. The next time she saw him months later across a crowded room, she didn't look away. She didn't smile either. She simply existed, unbothered, untethered, her worth no longer in negotiation. The woman who knows her worth doesn't beg, she watches. Then she rises.